My head is still thinking about everything I just heard. It's so interesting, and I think we've got connections. We're nodding along a lot. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I'm going to talk to you today about the Play Observatory, which is a UK project which actually ended up being accidentally international. I'm going to be talking about young children's play during the pandemic and thinking about how understanding that play could help inform how we support and think about children's play and their well-being in the future. So I'm a lecturer at the School of Education at the University of Sheffield, and I started working there just before the pandemic. Really bad timing. And I became involved in two linked projects. So first of all, I became the director of a British Academy research project called Childhood and Play. And this project is led by the University of Sheffield, and we collaborate with University College London, UCL. And that led to my involvement in becoming part of a team which won funding to research children's play and well-being during the COVID pandemic. So I'm going to introduce you to the Play Observatory Research Project, and I want to explore the role of play in supporting children's everyday connectedness during the pandemic. And via some examples, I'm going to first of all describe how the project was designed, and discuss the principles and the values about play and children's cultural roles that underpin it. And I want to share as many as I can of the wonderful examples of play and leisure experiences that young children and families share with us. The project was designed to cover childhood from birth to 18, but I'll concentrate on the examples of the younger age range. I also draw on some socio-material and post-humanist theory that I've recently been getting into to help examine what these examples tell us about young children, play and connectedness in pandemic times. And I want to think about the lessons we might take forward, but how we might support and think about those 21st century play that we haven't yet seen. So, researching pandemic during the first global pandemic of digital times was the task. I'm a historian of childhood and play, and my approach has always been to take a long view of the past and a long view of the present and think about how did we get here. But I've also always been future orientated. I want to consider what the past and present can tell us about the possibilities for the future and the many paths that we might or might not take as individuals, but also society. I think I'm used to mess and uncertainty, having been a nursery teacher, and I like thinking in messy ways about possibilities. So when the COVID pandemic started, I was very much aware of that link to past times of crisis, but also about preserving a record for the future about what young children and their families are experiencing, so that the record of the pandemic doesn't just become politicians, for example, especially given the work that families and early years teachers were doing to really keep everybody going during the pandemic. And I was very interested about the role that technology would play in both conducting the research, but in play as it unfolded. Thank you. So just to go back a bit, the Childhood and Play project that I was talking about earlier, that is one that basically brings together my university at Sheffield with UCL in London, and it's based on the archives of the folklorists of children's play, Iona and Peter Opie. So, beginning in the 1950s, they started to collect examples of children's play and games from across the United Kingdom. In the end, about 20,000 children over the 30 years contributed, mostly in writing with some drawings about their everyday play. And the Opies would send out questionnaires, very open-ended ones, they called them suggestionnaires, and they had this network of children and teachers and parents who were responding to them and building up this amazing archive. they started at a time when we were told, like we're told today, children don't play anymore. At that point it was television that was going to be the end of civilization. We have the same conversations now, usually about digital games, don't we? So this archive is huge. Most of it's in the Bodleian Museum Library at the University of Oxford, and the rest is at the Library of the Folklore Society in London. And our focus has helped us to then develop other projects that bring children of today in connection with this archive of children of the past. And they had a focus on everyday play, on children's cultural worlds, and on seeing children as being culturally productive, not just receiving culture, but actually generating and adding to our own culture. They had interest in forms of play and in the different cultural references that children used in their play, and we're interested in those references today and in the past too. So here are a couple of the previous projects that we've had. So there's one, Children's Playground Games and Songs in the New Media Age in 2009 to 11, and Playing the Archive, Memory, Community and Mixed Reality Play. That finished just the year before the pandemic. These projects connected contemporary children with the archive, and they brought those play to that now and in the past in conversation with each other. We developed an approach that we called playground ethnographies. So those projects were traditional projects that we went, and the researchers went to schools and engaged with children as co-researchers. So adult researchers were involved in making field notes and taking photographs, interviewing, doing audio recordings and video recordings. Child researchers were also trained up, and they were drawing and mapping their playgrounds, they were interviewing other children, they recorded amazing video tours of their playgrounds, and they wore GoPros on their chests during play as well. So really multimodal, ethnographic and participatory. So that was before the pandemic. So when the pandemic started, we knew straight away as a team that we wanted to research children's everyday play during the pandemic. And we were very clear that had OP still been alive, they would also have wanted to do that. So we came together very quickly and made a response to a funding call for various types of research about COVID. And we felt it was really important when a lot of the focus was on children in relation to schooling, that we don't lose focus on that bigger picture of their well-being and the everyday experiences they were having during this time of stress and uncertainty. And we wanted to make sure children and their perspectives, as I say, form part of the historical record. So this is our team. John Potter, Kate Cowan and Michelle Cannon came from UCL's Faculty of Education, and their research interests in digital literacy, media education, multimodality, play in early years. Dr. Valerio Signorelli from UCL's Bartlett Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis. His research is about urban environments and visualising data sets. He was very important in helping us create the tools to do the research online. And then from the University of Sheffield, myself, historian of childhood and play researcher, Julia Bishop and Kath Bannister, who are folklorists. So the team was multidisciplinary, bringing together these different research insights. You see our very colourful 8th member of the team at the bottom right of the screen, and I'll introduce you to them a bit later. And then we have project partners from the British Library, Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital, and that's really about that wellbeing aspect, and the Victoria Albert Museum of Childhood, which is now called Young V&A. And with them, we created an online exhibition at the end of the project, which I'll show you the link to. I really recommend if you're interested to go and explore. So, the research context we found ourselves in was tricky. We wrote the bid in May and June of 2020 during very severe national lockdown. Most schools, children in the UK were being homeschooled, there was no vaccine, very strict social and physical distancing measures we were talking about earlier. And obviously teachers and schools and settings were hugely overstretched. They were absolutely working so hard and very preoccupied. So the digital, adults and children were getting used to the digital world and digital communication, but there was also concern about digital safety. But bottom line, there was absolutely no prospect of us getting into schools or playgrounds or homes, so we had to change the approach. So the cloud observatory approach was one where we knew all the data needed to come to us via online methods. And we made a distinction between collecting data and generating data. So we knew play was happening. So I was at home, like most people. I was where my brother-in-law is an astrophysicist. He was locked out of his lab. He couldn't do any research. I was at home researching play during the pandemic with a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old in my house playing all the time. So I felt I wasn't working from home, I was now living at work. That's how I felt. So I was aware that children would already be playing and having amazing experiences and recording some of that as well. So there's stuff ready for us to collect. But also I felt it was useful if we could give prompts sometimes to generate some data, to prompt children and young people to create their multimodal representations, if you like, of their play in the pandemic and what it meant to them. So when we developed the project, there were 3 streams of data. The first was a national online survey accessed by a child-friendly website, and that was very much informed by the work we'd done on the OP's archive. They obviously weren't using digital means, everything was postal, but we were trying to think what we could learn from them. There were also a set of online ethnographic interviews with children and their families in the home, which were hysterically funny. To begin with, I think everybody thought that online interviewing was going to be a poor relation to normal interviews, but it's actually very democratic. The child is far more in control of an online interview than they would be in a face-to-face. They're the same size as us. They're very good at turning the laptops to make sure that mum or dad is out of the picture. If they don't want to continue, they close the lid. But also we had some exciting experiences when we were suddenly on an iPad being taken up the stairs and into a den. So really interesting things about control. And we also did some online media production workshops with the help of some young filmmakers, so some children who contributed their own films that they made to a survey. We were then invited to do make their own commissioned films for us. So, underpinning principles. Like the OPs, we wanted to really centre the child and the voice of the child as much as possible. Now, obviously, digital gets in the way of that. They've got to sign up themselves, they've got to have a parent help them. But wherever we did, we wanted to make sure that everything was addressed first to the child, and PEEPS became a hugely important member of the team for doing that. So PEEPS was co-designed with children. My aforementioned 9 and 12-year-old designed PEEPS. And PEEPS became, I think, more like a puppet. Is that idea that they're explaining their play to PEEPS, and PEEPS is explaining our project to children. And so throughout the survey, PEEPS always appears first at the top, and any blue text is addressed to children, and then parents are addressed as kind of second-class citizens in this particular hierarchy. Thank you. The next thing also was we wanted to really value the complexity and ambiguity of children's play and their cultural worlds. And we wanted to recognise the emotional complexity of play. And so we designed to be experimental in our online survey. And the survey tool we use is actually more used for biomedical research. But it does have this facility where you can embed images within the survey. And so we decided to use emojis as an opportunity to prompt children to think about their emotions during that play or as they think back to that play when they're putting things into the survey. So there was a prompt question in the text box asking them if they wanted to, what was their mood when the display happened, and did it change how they were feeling. And then they were asked if they wanted to use emojis, and if they said yes, then they got this set of 7 different potential emojis to choose from, and they were allowed to choose as many or as few as they wanted to. And they were actually really nice prompts to get some interesting responses from the children. We also then put a parental response box at the bottom, and often when the parents talked about it, was the emotion that they were then reflecting on. So, if we start thinking about then the lenses which we can use to think about some of our contributions, I really want to approach the data in ways that can tune us into how play is part of children's everyday connectedness. And it's a connectedness that involves not just human, but the more than human. And I'd like to also help us appreciate that despite the pandemic, despite the disruption to their usual social networks and schools and settings, in play, children were in deep forms of entanglement that were often inter- and intra-generational. So this is really thinking about reconceptualising the pandemic. I think often, quite understandably, we kind of conceptualised as a rupture. We were kind of yanked out of our normal lives into this new, very strange place. And we really felt that lack of connection. But I think we could start to think about it differently as a kind of pivot. So things didn't stop entirely, they kind of changed direction, and the nature of our entanglement also changed. So the post-humanist scholar Karen Barrows writes that crucially agency is a matter of interacting, it's an enactment, not something that someone or something has. Agency is doing, being in its interactivity. When I first read that, it just made my brain hurt, but I really started to think about it more when I was looking at these examples. So in post-humanist theory, people are not beings who are separate from space, time and matter and choose to interact with it and impose their will on it. Instead, human space, time and matter interact. And in that interaction, rather than inhabiting the space of being, bodies are in a constant state of becoming that emerges from their interactions. So, how can this idea of entangled interaction help us think about the children's pandemic play experience? Post-humanist theory, I think, is really helpful in helping us resist separating the pandemic out into different categories of relationships, material, space and time. And it can start helping us to think about actually, yes, in the UK, lockdown measures did restrict most children to the physical location of the home and the near environment, but it facilitated an intensification of the material, discursive and relational entanglements in these spaces. And the digital became part of that. It brought family work, school practices into the home. And the past and the present and the future were also all there at the same time. We were experiencing our current circumstances, but old knowledges and practices kept coming in. A number of people who talk about finding board games for the first time in lots of years. Yeah, I was doing jigsaws, haven't done a jigsaw in decades. So there's old knowledges, but also this adaptation towards future possibilities. So I'm going to share some examples with these ideas in mind. This idea about our contributions are snapshots. They're little snapshots of events. And I really like the work of Bernard Merchant, who talked about the singularity of an event. And the idea that we can think about the different possibilities and coming together in an event. and any event will be a product of things that we can't see in the snapshot. And also any event could lead to lots of different possibilities. I also like the idea of affective intensities that I've seen in lots of work, for example, about the idea that actually these little pockets in time are about unfolding really intense emotions that can be joy, but they can also be, darker things. So, this first example I absolutely adore. So, at the beginning of the pandemic, adults in particular were often reporting references to the pandemic in children's play. This is an example of this. So we've got some hands and hand sanitizer. I love the fact that the hand also has hands, and the sanitizer also has hands. And there's lots of personality there. They're both smiling. So this came from a 4-year-old who signed up as a contributor to the survey, and we have some text. It's a mixture of her play and creativity being reported by the parent, but some direct quotes from the child herself and the accompanying emoji that they've chosen to represent what the play felt like. I thought the middle section of the text is very poignant, with the report from the parent of the child being asking when she can go places again, and the quote, when the germs have gone. Demonstrating her understanding of the cause of the pandemic, circumstances that she's currently navigating. So I think there's lots of things that you can see when you look at this picture. You can see that that there's that contribution talks about the physical constraints of the pandemic and not going to places, but the idea of an imagined future when we can again. There's the emergent hygiene practice being focused on, the hand cleaning and the language associated with disease and contagion. I think the eyes and the hand character are really fascinating because they're very cartoon-like eyes, and it makes me actually wonder where this image has come from. Is this something that the child has learned by looking at particular ways of drawing? It's quite anime, isn't it? Has there been some collaboration between child and parent? And I think there's lots of hybridity and flow from the discursive and artistic and material practices. We've got the felt tip pens and paper, but then it's been captured by digital technology onto a screen and then shared across time and space with loved ones outside the home. So there's deep entanglement here and productive interaction very evident. And there's similar contribution. Emotional tone here is really interesting. So this was actually just before the first lockdown this drawing was made. And the accompanying text talks about everything has coronavirus because it's been outside. Apart from the medium tree because it stayed inside. And the tiny tree is crying because it doesn't understand what's happening. So there's an awful lot of understanding and thinking happening there. And the parent who responded to that prompt about the mood by saying that actually the child was very serious and thoughtful whilst drawing. So we thought the discourse here, the sudden significance and danger of being outside is reflected in her words and the elements, such as the frowns and the sad faces on the non-human characters in the drawing. And it's a bit of a morality tale, the big trees are sad, the tiny trees crying, doesn't understand. Oh, and the little tree is smiling because it stayed inside. So many things to think about, and I'm still trying to work out. There's lots of dots on the trees and the clouds and what looks like several suns. Is that a metaphor for the virus? I don't know. So this one I think is really beautiful. On its own, this image of colourfully painted rocks, decorated with paints, rainbows, a key motif of the early pandemic. It's like many images that we all saw. But the commentary and the prompt to reflect on emotion allows us to perceive greater layers within that image. And I think it helps us to reflect on the entanglement. So the text tells us this is a collection of painted rocks, and they're the collective work of different children from the first lockdown of 2020. So painting and leaving stones on a doorstep with a friend at a kindergarten is an adult-initiated activity that children and their families are invited to join in. And the photograph captures this collective artwork in progress. It captures the carefully curated presence of each stone, and the doorstep of the kindergarten becomes this anchoring place. If we look at this collection, it really invites us to consider the lines of flight that each stone will have followed to reach this space. So the image hints at traces of people, ideas and things that lie outside of its framing. So we can think about the hands of the children and adults who collected, washed, painted and carried the stones here to place them. The eyes that have looked down on the growing collection and discussions and decisions that have happened in order to decide whether to place a new contribution. There's a genre of similar images that have been drawn on and perhaps reflected in the design choices. And the kindergarten doorstep itself, instead of being this liminal space, this opening to a collective play space for children, has become both a closed boundary, but also an open invitation for a personal offering that contributes to a kind of public ritual that is actually ultimately an expression of love and belonging and participation. So that final comment on the accompanying text is given in response to the prompt about the mood. So the stones may look cheerful and colourful, but the effect of encountering them in this invitation is more complex. For the child, there's thoughtfulness and loss, and the event provides this provocation for the space to allow them to articulate and acknowledge that loss and have it acknowledged intergenerationally. I love this image so much. So again, one of the COVID measures in the UK was the recommendation for a daily walk. And in this example, we see three siblings playing together inside a large tyre tractor. The text of the contribution tells us the family came across these tyres when they were out for their early evening walk, and they would be left there on the local rugby ground by the rugby players who'd been training with them. And it's really interesting how the children are repurposing the tyres, and they're demonstrating how spaces and materials can be used is open to children's interpretation and their reinterpretation. So the traces of previous play from grown-ups about weight training is become this playful embodied exploration of a different trace of play, becoming entangled in new play. And they're exploiting different features of the tyre than the rugby players would have been doing. And they're exploring the affordances that they give them for climbing and jumping and hiding. So this image is a snapshot of entangled elements, human and non-human, children, adults, space, materials and time. And the parent reports the mood is relaxed, happy and inventive. And I think the imagery captures this embodied sensory moment. Play with the cousins. We have the digital play again. We saw a lot of play with cousins happening in our contributions, and play across households that obviously could have happened in other ways. So in this example, a 10-year-old boy from Leeds and a 6-year-old cousin in Bristol, they are having this hybrid digital, offline, online, dynamic type of play. They called it FaceTime Art Club. And in this example, we can see how an idea from homeschooling for the older child became adapted and adopted by the younger child and created her own version of that event. And when they moved on to other types of play within that space, it would start as FaceTime Art Club, but it would kind of disintegrate into something completely different. So hybrid and dynamic. They would be stopping doing the art to put virtual stickers on each other's faces, and then they would also play a form of hide and seek, where they would direct an aunt and uncle to go and hide the other child on the iPad somewhere in the house, and then instruct their aunt or uncle to walk from room to room, showing them each room until they found each other. So this retelling and repurposing of ideas from homeschooling, but we've also got that fluidity of exploring play sometimes a play that some people might shut down, but actually has led to really interesting connection between these two children, that emergent, interacting entanglement. We see this again, this was not the only family to be playing hide and seek by iPad, and we've got intergenerational examples there, and the different affordances of being able to play hide and seek with your grandparents, when your grandparents can hide inside a kitchen drawer or underneath a bed far more easily than they would in real life. So I love that idea about these entanglements happening in really interesting and novel ways. So not just about loss of play, but actually reinvention of play. Another example is a really lovely example from across two countries. This is a child in Germany with grandparents elsewhere in the world who made matching cardboard box dolls houses, and then would actually direct each other in their play, mirroring each other in their play, and developing play narratives and worlds, where they were playing with the same ideas but developing them, so lots of iterations of play. So I think, again, if you think about that as productive entanglement, we've got the child, parents and grandparents, the repurposed materials, the furniture, the digital technology, the cultural knowledge, and space and time. That was, I think, a real gift for some children in the pandemic, of space and time to do play that they come back to a lot. And then my final example, which I absolutely adore, I roared with laughter when I found this in our survey. It really spoke to me. It was a kind of recognition as well as joy when I encountered it. So, for many of us, one of the key features of the pandemic was working from home. For children, also that meant homeschooling. But for adults, it meant bringing the practices, language, and artefacts of work into the home. Perhaps for the first time, but probably far more intensely and intrusively than before. And I remember thinking, what was it like for this generation of children, getting much more than the occasional glimpse behind the curtain of the adult world of work than I'd experienced as a child. So my children and myself, we learned my husband's work voice that he uses on work phone calls. We laughed a lot and do impressions of him. My children learned what a lecture sounds like and what a research meeting sounds like, and they joined in, hence peeps. Our wonderful 8th member. But this contribution, this parent explains how her child became intrigued by the sketch of the probability tree, and that wonderful mummy, how did you draw this amazing rocket? And the fact the child was immediately then set about drawing his own version. So going back to my question about the pandemic as ruptural pivot, this example to me demonstrates how lockdown circumstances produced new forms of entanglement as child and adult, school and work, different forms of cultural knowledge, material practices, space and time all interacted. So what does children's play in the pandemic draw our attention to? I'd say there's deep and complex entanglement of human and non-human, that emergent becoming through entangled interaction despite lockdown. Ideas becoming matter. That's right, I think I love it, and I think that reminds me of that social imagination, that if we can think it, we can make it. We can make it matter in both senses of the word. We can make it physical matter, we can make it matter to us as people and as societies. And I think what's really interesting to me is that children have something to say about their experience. They're not just reporting it, they can also tell us about it. They have something to tell us about how they see us during the pandemic. We had some wonderful films. My favourite one is one called Blue Paper Holder, which stars a toddler who's going around telling of adults, so taking all the toilet rolls from the supermarket. So lots of commentary there from children about adults being rather silly. So my question is really thinking, how do we support this flourishing of possibility, connection and playful participation? How can we examine how entanglements create and shape emergent playful interaction?
what are children involved and entangled with, and also what are the implications for social justice. I'm very much aware that, in order to contribute to our survey, you had to have access to the digital. So what do we do about children who don't necessarily have that at home? And I'm very mindful in early years there's often a tension and sometimes a suspicion about using digital tools and devices, and this idea it might be pushing out play. I'd say we saw a lot of hybrid play, but I think often we have to do work to persuade parents that actually it's a valid form of play and it's not something that's going to happen at the expense of other forms of play. So finally, I'm thinking really about how do we champion the importance of the open-ended emergence in a world that is focused on end goals and catching up with lost learning. So conventional reflections on the examples I've shared could lead us to commend our child contributors for their resourcefulness during the pandemic. And we might praise those who seem to exercise agency and demonstrate their resourcefulness as a personal quality. And we might seek deficit explanations of those who we fear did not. But I think the post-humanist refraction helps us to break down the concept of resourcefulness and to acknowledge the many different forms of interacting entanglement that contribute to children experiencing that. So if we could appreciate how play supports that constitution and reconstitution and refiguring of children's affective networks in complex, multimodal and emergent ways, it opens us up to thinking about what we can do then to help them have that possibility for the future. So there has been sadness and loss during the pandemic, but there has been rich, productive, entangled interaction, and the result of a possibility of different becomings. So I think for all of us who dream for and with children, our entangled, interacting, child-friendly provision, if we look through a post-humanist COVID lens, we need to be committed to opening up this possibility of different becomings. And that's what I worry about end goals, because they're closing down lots of other possibilities. But I'd say children really need to be able to come together with space, time and matter to connect and playfully unfold. Thank you.